QSO Today, episode 248, Jerry Lewine K6QU. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, who will be demonstrating the new IC 9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver later this month at the Dayton Hamvention. If you're going to Dayton, be sure to check it out. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Hans Summers, G0UPL's QRP Radio Kit Company. Hans has an amazing catalog of radio kits and parts for every budget. QRP Labs will also be at the Dayton Hamvention and at the QRP International 4 Days in May event. I want to thank both ICOM and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. My QSO guest has a similar ham radio story to my own. I tell my ham radio story in episode 200. However, I was working in two-way radio and communications for many years, doing radio all day long, so ham radio was not what I did after work hours. Jerry Lewine, K6QU, has a similar story, where he worked in broadcast radio for his career and only returned to ham radio in 2010. While we talk about broadcast radio, Jerry discovered that ham radio is more exciting now, even if you are still preferring the traditional operating modes like CW. Perhaps because Jerry lives in Los Angeles, the area where I also grew up, that this QSO Today felt to be less formal and more familiar. K6QU, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Jerry?
I'm here, K6QU. Hi, Eric.
Hey, Jerry. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. 2 years ago, I received an email from a ham in South Africa who suggested you as a QSO Today guest because you offered to be a remote mentor to him. So I'm glad that we finally caught up and are having this QSO Today.
I don't recall who that person was, but I do my best to be a mentor, or an Elmer as they call it now.
He was impressed enough that he sent me an email.
Well, that's sweet. I give code practice. I give CW practice on the air to anybody who will do it with me.
Whether fast or slow, you'll go the gropes.
Absolutely. I took one guy who was an American expat who moved to Costa Rica, and we started him off at about 3 words a minute, and when we finally quit about a year later, he was up to about 25.
Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, okay. I don't think there was any one thing that started me and that got me into ham radio. I do think it's in my DNA. And I think if those scientists who spend all their time with DNA studying ancestry and what makes us susceptible to certain diseases spent a few minutes, they would find strands that are common among all ham radio operators.
Right. We have the knack, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, when I was a little kid, my dad was an optometrist, and he had kind of a scientific bent. He was incredibly interested in optics, as you might expect. So, but he bought me a chemistry set, he bought me an erector set, and a magnifying glass and a microscope. So I kind of leaned that way. But I remember a friend built a crystal set. And he told me, he could hear our local radio station back in Indiana, Pennsylvania, WDAD. We only had one. I used to walk by Ralph Moorhead, his TV repair shop. So one day I went in there, and he had, televisions and radios all torn apart. And in the back on his workbench, he was a ham. I think he had a Gonset radio, now that I think about it. Anyway, and I heard him talking to people. And I kind of thought that was something interesting that I might want to do. Anyway, I remember my mom, I was probably about 10, and my mother took me to a hobby shop. We only had one hobby shop. Do they still have hobby shops?
Oh, they might. Now they sell drones.
And yeah, times have changed.
Right.
She bought me a one-tube radio, and it was an Armstrong one-tube radio. I looked it up once. You can still buy it on eBay. one of these things. Anyway, I remember I put it together and I listened to our local radio station, WDAD, since we only had one. Once in a while, after they signed off, I could hear even more distant stations. And I thought that might be one of the early triggers for getting me into DX. I could tell you what happened to that Armstrong one-tube radio. It was sitting on the stairs leading down to the basement, and my brother and I were having a hose fight down there. And my mother came down the stairs to yell at us and turn the hoses off and quit getting the basement all wet. And she tripped and fell on the Armstrong one-tube radio, and that was the end of the Armstrong one-tube radio. In any event, my dad, one of his patients was Cliff Porter, W3IYI, and he introduced me to him. Cliff worked at that radio station, WDAD, and remarkably gave me a tour of that station. This guy was totally blind. He passed away long ago. Nice guy. Anyway, he aimed his white cane at every piece of equipment in that rack and told me what it was. He couldn't see it. He just knew what it was, where it was, and what it did.
Was he the engineer of the station?
No, he actually was a copywriter.
Uh-huh. But in love with radio.
But he told me, yeah, he was a total CW op, and he told me, he said, you're so fascinated with radio, you really ought to get into ham radio because you don't just listen, you can actually talk to people on the other side. So that also got me interested. Then my dad took me over to see somebody else who was a high school principal, W3FVU, Shel Davis. And I remember sitting down with him. Again, this is before I had my ham license, so I must have been about 10. And he sat me down, and he was talking to somebody in Alaska, and he put the microphone, it was a D104, I remember that, in front of my face, and I got mic fright. I couldn't say a word. But maybe that's why I spend most of my time on CW.
So when did you get your first license?
I took the test when I was 10, and the license came when I was 11. It took 3 months for that to happen. So that was 1959.
And that was your novice license, right?
That was my novice license.
And
I was KN3OLG. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. No, KN3OLG. Good. And what was your first rig then?
I continue to have I had a short attention span back then, and I still do. Mm-hmm. So I went through a series of them. I had a Heathkit and an AR3 receiver. I had an AT1 transmitter. I had an ARC-5, a Hammerland HQ-129 receiver. I went through so much stuff back then.
You still have the AT1?
No.
You can buy the AT1.
No, I know you can buy that stuff, and I see it for sale at
No. I'm telling you, they're now making the AT1 kit. Look up newamico.com on the
Really?
internet. Yeah. The guy started it's called the newamico.com. He's getting all the parts from Russia, and it's a kit sold exactly like it was sold before.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, for your information.
Okay. I graduated. I eventually had a DX100. I had a sideband, a Central Electronics 10A, 10B, 20A. I don't remember. My first sideband radio. No, that's not true. I built a homebrew one. I continued to keep changing equipment, but I guess we can get to that later.
Right. Well, you have pictures on your QRZ page also that show kind of an evolution of you as you've gotten older with the gear in front of the gear.
The gear has gotten younger, and I have gotten older.
Right, but as you got older, the gear was changing behind you, and it's also a very interesting. I'm suggesting to the listeners that they look at your QRZ page because it's a very interesting progression in styles as well. If you're looking at haircuts and clothes.
Are you referring to the hippie ham picture?
Yeah. I remember the time. I remember the studs on a pair of jeans I had with studs up and down the sides.
Oh yeah. I remember those.
Yeah. There was no accounting for taste in those days.
Well, tastes continue to evolve. Things like that might come back someday. Now people have studs in their
everything, right,
in their bodies. Yeah.
How did it go from there? Were you active? Did you become active in an amateur radio club in your town?
I belonged to the Indiana Amateur Radio Club. I still remember most of those people. And I won't bother you with names and call letters because all of them are long gone.
Did you have peers that were also your age that were also active?
There were a couple, Bill Smith, K6SIS, who unfortunately died just a couple of years ago. I used to love to go over to Paul W3YOK's house because not only was he a ham, but he also had a really cute daughter. And interestingly, she and her husband came here and visited us about a year ago.
Amazing.
She's still cute. In her 70s, she's still cute. Anyway, where were we?
Well, in high school, you were an active amateur radio operator.
I was.
Was amateur radio leading you down a path that would take you into a profession in electronics?
Let's go back a little bit. I eventually got a job as a transmitter watcher at WDAD, that radio station we mentioned before. That was on weekends, and I know that was before I could drive because my parents used to drive me out to the transmitter site. And I took readings every half hour. And on the weekends also, I got to be an announcer once in a while.
There was a name for that job, wasn't there? You sent me a little backgrounder before we talked. Actually, you sent it to me a couple of years ago. And they used to call those guys daytimers, right?
Oh, the radio stations. No, the radio stations were daytimers if they had to sign off at sundown. I think what you're referring to is later on, when I was in college, I worked at WEEP, which was a country station in Pittsburgh, and it was a daytimer. So turned out it was eventually became a 50,000 watt daytimer. So it signed on at sunrise, signed off at sunset, and that sign on and sign off time changed depending on the season, of course. Later on, they got pre-sunrise at low power and post-sunset at lower power.
Right. So unless you were a clear channel station that operated 24/7, you were a daytimer, which meant you were off at sunset.
Well, no, clear channel station's something else. Actually, I don't think they have clear channels anymore. No, there were AM stations that were on 24/7. Some were non-directional, some were directional. Clear channel at the time meant you owned that frequency.
Like KFI or KOA.
Like KFI.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that was clear channel at one time. Now, as you travel across the country, there will be other stations on that frequency.
So where did it go from there? You were going to go back a little bit into your high school years. You got a job at WDAD?
I got a job at WDAD. WDAD eventually got a remote control unit, so they didn't need people to go out and make $1.10 an hour while they were taking transmitter readings. So I wanted to have my own radio station, so I built one. I would come home from high school, sign on the radio station. It would be on for a few hours, and then we'd sign off. It was a Viking Adventurer with a modulator that I built and a long wire antenna. And we actually got out about 65 miles. So I would come home from school and turn the transmitter on every day. And I had friends who were DJs on my radio station. I called it WSIK, Sick Radio. And one day I came home from school, and there was a gray Plymouth parked in the driveway, and on the side it said Interagency Motor Pool, Buffalo, New York, and it had government plates on it. So I knew that was the end. And waiting for me was C.L. Spencer. I don't know if you remember, but long ago there were ads in the back of like Popular Science. Get your first class, FCC license, and they showed a sample FCC first class license, and it was signed by C.L. Spencer. Anyway, there was C.L. Spencer in our house talking to my parents, telling them that they could be fined $10,000 a day for each day the offense occurs. So he ate dinner.
He stayed for dinner?
He stayed for dinner. My dad took out some beer, and they talked for a while. Anyway, C.L. Spencer said, "Okay, you can be on the air tomorrow to sign off and tell everybody you're leaving, but you better not sign on again." So the next day, we did exactly that. And the Viking Adventure left the broadcast band and went back to becoming a ham radio.
And you were in the AM broadcast band with the Viking Adventure?
That was in the AM broadcast band. It was on 1200, a nice clear channel.
And now this message from ICOM America. Create your own band opening. ICOM's newest SDR transceiver, the IC9700, is coming soon. This new VHF, UHF, and 1.2 GHz all-mode transceiver brings ICOM's direct sampling to the VHF, UHF weak signal world. This radio really has me excited by the possibilities of being able to operate moon bounce or meteor scatter, or with some additional components, the ES-HALE 2 geosynchronous satellite. The IC9700 has the same form factor as the IC7300 and will certainly complement your existing HF radios. The IC9700 all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features such as dedicated amateur satellite operation, color touchscreen, built-in D-Star capability, RF direct sampling on the VHF and UHF bands, dual independent receivers capable of full duplex operation, as well as Dual Watch, ICOM's feature to allow you to listen in two places at the same time. Output power on the IC9700 is 100 watts on 2 meters, 75 on 70 centimeters, and 10 watts on 1.2 gigahertz. The ICOM IC9700 is available now from your local ICOM dealer. If you're going to the Dayton Hamvention this May, be sure to stop at the ICOM booth in Building 2 to see the new IC9700 and ICOM's complete line of amateur radio transceivers for every band and every ham radio operator. You can become one of the lucky winners to take home some limited edition swag kits by visiting ICOM's website to enter the drawing by clicking on the IC9700 image in this week's show notes page. I'm grateful to have ICOM as a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast and appreciate their support. And when you buy your ICOM 9700 or any other fine ICOM product, be sure to tell your ICOM dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Did C.L. Spencer encourage you to get your broadcast license?
No.
And go to work for a legitimate station?
He didn't encourage me, but it was in my DNA. I absolutely had to do it. So I got my first class FCC license. You know, I got my general, I got my extra. Was on that path. It was the height of the Vietnam War. I'm going to step ahead a few years. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh. I'd been going to school 4 years, hadn't graduated yet, so I was drafted. Joined the Air Force. They sent me to Vandenberg Air Force Base. Then the Air Force allowed me to go back to Pitt to graduate. Then I was sent to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, where I bootlegged.
Well, what did they have you do?
In the Philippines?
You were in the Air Force. What did they have you do? Here you are, a BSCE?
When I was at Vandenberg, I was in ground air radio. When I went to Clark in the Philippines, we had an AM/FM TV station. So I was in AFRTS, back where I belonged.
You actually became a broadcast engineer for the U.S. Air Force.
Yes, I did.
Amazing.
Got out of the Air Force, went back to Pittsburgh, ran into my old boss from WEEP, W-E-E-P, and I said, I need a job. You got anything? And he said, no, we don't have anything here in Pittsburgh, but if you want to go to Hawaii, there's an opening to be chief engineer of our radio station in Honolulu, and we'll move you. And I think I had said yes before we finished the sentence. So my wife and I picked up and moved to Oahu.
Wow. You remember what station?
It was KGMB, which was the radio station, big radio station. That was the radio station the Japanese were listening to when they came to bomb Pearl Harbor. One of the first jobs I had to do when I got there, the manager had me, he says, we're going to move an automation system in there for the FM into this room here. And there's a whole bunch of old equipment in there. Call a dump truck, company and just dump it all, would you? So clean the room out. So he said, by the way, that was the equipment that Waverly Edwards, that was his studio, that was the equipment that he was using when the Japanese came to bomb Pearl Harbor. So instead of sending that stuff off to the Smithsonian where it belonged, it went on a dump truck. I'm still kicking myself.
Okay, you didn't take it home.
No, I didn't take it home. I certainly should have. Oh, well.
KGMB, was it also, there was also another station there, KPOA in Hawaii?
Sure.
There were multiple stations there.
Oh, my God, yes. Every frequency where you could put a radio station, somebody did.
In Hawaii?
None of them were making, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Amazing.
Because over here, they're so close together, you're protecting stations. The AM directionals. But over there, you're out in the middle of the Pacific. So the only stations you have to worry about interfering with are ones on the islands. So there were a lot of radio stations there, all trying to share the same limited amount of radio
market
advertising
share.
Money.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, this is very cool.
Anyway, I got a ham license there. I was K6QU. I loved DXing. I had a house right on the water. Had a vertical out at the side of the boat dock with radials going into the Kaneohe Bay, and I was only running 100 watts. And there was a guy up the hill. I forget his call, but he had a big tower, the big antenna. It was running high power, and we'd get in pileups, and I would always beat him out because that vertical was stuck in the right above the salt water.
Right, and life was sweet. So what happened after that?
That job lasted about a year and a half, and it was time to move back. So shipped all the stuff to L.A., flew to L.A. when the car finally got there, started driving up the coast looking for work.
So you went to L.A. without
a job.
Without a job. And why L.A.? You thought you wanted to be on the West Coast?
I wanted to be on the West Coast, and I wanted to be in radio.
I see.
One of the places I stopped was where I was offered a job en route was going up the coast was designing potentiometers, and I just can't think of anything more boring in my life than something like that. Eventually, I stopped in Monterey.
So I'm going to keep interrupting you, Jerry, because you keep throwing out these amazing pearls. So you went door to door. You arrived back in Southern California. I'm assuming in the early '70s, and you went door to door looking for any kind of electronic job, including broadcasting jobs, by the way. So did you hit all of the radio stations and all the TV stations?
Couldn't find anything in L.A. Couldn't find anything in Santa Barbara. Just kept going up the coast. Landed in Monterey. Called a radio station. Said, do you need anybody? They said, you need to call Dick Adler. WA3KPF was his call at the time. He was a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. And I called him up, and I told him who I was and what I was interested in doing. He says, good. Can you meet me at midnight tonight? So sure. So that started my career in broadcasting around the Monterey Bay area. Eventually, I was chief engineer of 9 radio stations simultaneously.
In that mid-California, it's not quite Northern California, but kind of between Southern and Northern California on the coast there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, south of San Jose, Monterey, Salinas, Santa Cruz. Built a radio station in King City, helped out at radio stations in Santa Cruz. I was really busy.
Wow.
And I dropped out of ham radio. Because I had been working, I was working in radio, maybe 18 hours a day. I didn't want to come home and turn on another radio.
I mean, if you love radios, it's really cool. It may not have been really cool if you were doing it 18 hours a day, but...
Oh, Eric, I got burnout. Just got burnout. So that's when...
You got to meet some of famous personalities, even some that I might have already interviewed. Isn't that right? You told me that you met Art Bell.
Art Bell and I met each other when I was in the Air Force, and he had just gotten out of the Air Force, and I lived in Santa Maria. This is when I was at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Art was a DJ at KSEE, and we met and smoked pot together. When there was we palled around, had a great old time. Later on, when I was at KDON in Salinas, Art Bell was a DJ there. So we just kept in touch at various radio stations and through ham radio for all those years. Here, you want a famous person that I met when I was at Clark in the Philippines? The guy who flew the Spirit of St. Louis.
Charles Lindbergh.
Charles Lindbergh came through the radio station. He was an explorer. He was exploring in southern Luzon, and he had discovered a tribe, the Tassides, I think they were. Anyway, he came through the radio station, and I got to meet him. That's probably the most famous person I've ever met.
Well, Art Bell was a famous ham as well. He was W6OBB for the listeners, and he was episode 85 of the QSO Today podcast, and the second most popular episode in the QSO Today podcast downloads.
Really?
Yeah.
Art was a heck of a guy, and I miss him dearly.
And he was a mighty fine guest as well. So he is missed. He's been gone a couple years now, I think.
Yeah, I was going to visit Art when Art lived in the Philippines. I was going to visit him over there. And when I was making travel arrangements, he ended up moving back to the U.S. So I made the trip anyway.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today. You were out of ham radio maybe for 25, 30 years?
Yep.
And when did you come back?
When I got burnt out in Monterey taking care of so many radio stations. I got a call from one of the DJs who had left Salinas and moved to Ventura. And he called me up. He said, "Would you like to come to Ventura and be our engineer?" I said, "Yeah." So packed up and moved to Ventura and was engineer for that radio station and a couple more for a while. I'll get back to getting back into ham radio in a second. Mm-hmm. They were bought out by a group who decided that I was making too much money and told me, "We're going to be giving you a pay cut." I said, "No, you're not." So you have my 2 weeks notice. So I knew I could get a job in L.A. So I got a job in L.A. for far more than I was making in Ventura. I stayed there at that station for a couple of years. Then I got a job at another radio station, another group. I eventually was the chief engineer of what some of us remember as the number one rock and roll station in the country, KHJ. At the time,
KHJ.
It was That's the one.
That's the one.
I've got all the jingles here.
That was my favorite as a kid growing up in Southern California was 93 KHJ.
Yeah. I used to listen to it.
KHJ had an AM station and a television station, Channel 9, I believe.
They also had an FM station that's now K-Earth. That was KHJ FM. Anyway, one day I was at a transmitter site belonging to them, and accepting delivery of a new transmitter, and I slipped and fell and broke the bottom of my femur.
Oh, yeah. My assistant came. I called him on the cell phone. I said, "You got to get out here. Get me to the hospital." I could feel it. I could hear it when it broke. So they took me to the hospital. He took me to the hospital. They put a cast on it. I don't want to go into this, but they didn't get it together right. So I had multiple surgeries after that. I was out of work for a year and a half. And basically at that time, after a year and a half of surgeries, my career went away. So I retired
and got back into ham radio.
So you got back into ham radio about 2009, 2010?
No, that was the end of 2010 when this happened. So, and I'm still having knee issues. In a couple of weeks, in about a month, I'm having a knee replacement. Finally, they're finally going to get it right after almost 20 years of misery. Anyway, so I got back into ham radio big time.
Well, that's amazing. It's amazing that you did. But so, what is it you like to do in ham radio now?
I am a confirmed DXer, and I mentor whenever I can.
What does that mean, being a confirmed DXer? Does that mean that when you have a chance, you're on the air chasing DX?
Not when I have a chance. I do it semi-obsessively. Even right now, I'm a confirmed CW person, but now when we're at the bottom of the sunspot cycle, I've even resorted to FT8. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that.
No. By the way, we discuss FT8 in just about every episode of the QSO Today podcast for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you like it?
Do I like FT8?
Yeah.
I like making contacts. I think. Do I like the concept of my computer talking to somebody else's computer through the radio? No, not at all. People scoff at it, but it is what it is. It's another mode of communication. Way back when single sideband first came out, people poo-pooed single sideband. Oh, it sounds like Donald Duck. People always poo-poo the next thing that comes along. I think someday there's going to be an FT8, a version of FT8 or digital that allows you to make CW and sideband contacts below the noise level, because things will evolve.
I think there's something like that almost already. I mean,
okay.
It doesn't
heard
seem
about that.
No. It seems to me that that's not a big deal. I mean, from the standpoint that you could use a bug or a key and load a buffer in a computer and have it go out FT8 and then spit back. Now there's a version of FT8, and I'm going to beg. I'm going to ask the listeners to forgive me for getting it wrong, but it's something like FT8 call or something like that is what I'm hearing, where you can actually put a message in the message.
Okay.
So you can actually have some kind of a conversation using the FT8 format.
Okay.
So I think we're close.
In real time?
I think we're close.
Okay.
One of my friends is Wayne Burdick, N6KR, who is the CTO of Elecraft. And the last time I was there, he was showing me that he can enter on one of his radios on the KX2. He can actually use the paddles to make CW into the radio, and it comes out RTTY.
Oh, okay.
So it seems to me that we're probably very close to being able to simulate a CW conversation on one of these digital modes so that you can operate CW under the noise.
Okay. No doubt when that becomes popular, it will have its detractors also. But, life evolves. Things change.
Well, these digital modes have made it possible for people that couldn't do it before to actually do moon bounce, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You don't have to have a lot of real estate and a huge array now to bounce signals off the moon. We've got a pair of beams and a 500-watt amplifier.
Yep.
You're bouncing signals off the moon. So I think that you're right. Every new thing might have its detractors, but isn't it exciting?
Oh, beyond exciting. I can't wait. I'm 72 now. I think I told you earlier, you're invited to my 100th birthday. I want to see what ham radio is going to be like on my 100th birthday. It's going to be nothing like we have now, but it'll be around.
Do you think that Moore's Law applies to the evolution of ham radio technology?
Oh, I see that every day. I can't wait. Well, actually, I can. I want the next 30 years of my life to go very slowly.
While it seems like it's going very quickly, at least from my perspective, it seems like every time I blink, it's been another week. It's been a while since you've actually been working in the broadcast industry, 8-9 years now. But you shared with me a little bit of a story about a retiring broadcast engineer who asked you to help out. Can you tell that story a little bit? We're setting the stage for the question I'm going to ask you.
There are no young broadcast engineers that I am aware of. The person who called me, Norm, was the chief engineer of KFI, big radio station. He retired many years ago, and he got called.
It's probably the biggest in Southern California, KFI.
KFI, or
50,000 watt station in the center of Orange County.
Yeah. KFI, right. Big, enormous station. And he retired, and he couldn't retire. They called him. Other radio stations called him back, AM stations, because nobody knows AM radio anymore. Nobody knows directional antennas anymore. Bert certainly does. But, we're all of the same generation. I don't know what's going to happen when we're gone. But maybe AM radio will be gone.
Do you think that ham radio operators, young ham radio operators, can be trained easily to be able to take over the responsibilities of these kinds of stations?
Can they?
And if not, what do they need to learn?
They need to learn to troubleshoot. They don't necessarily need the theory, but they need to be able, their mindset has to be in such a way that they're able to diagnose a problem and get down to the problem. Once you've narrowed the problem down to something, then it's pretty obvious how to fix it.
Right. So you don't necessarily have to know how vacuum tubes work exactly, although if you're in the business, then you kind of start to figure it out, right?
Right. There aren't that many vacuum tubes left in the broadcast industry.
So a 50,000 watt station...
They're solid state.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, 50,000 watt transmitters now are 6 feet tall and 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep, and they're all solid state.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. It used to be a modulation transformer for a 50,000 watt radio station. Plate modulation transformer would fill half a room. You don't need that anymore. Now, all these transmitters are modularized. So when if a transistor blows, you pull that module out while the transmitter's on the air, and you put another one in. You fix the problem.
Do you have a sense that there may be an opportunity for young hams or young people that have the knack and have the ability to troubleshoot, that it might be easier to become a broadcast engineer in a major market?
I would say that...
Unlike all of the guys in your generation who had to start in the minor markets in order to get to the major markets.
I think there's truth to that. I don't know that there are people who want to do that. I think a lot of the techies now are doing things related to the digital world. Broadcast radio is not part of their consciousness. I'm generalizing.
No, I think you might be right on the one hand.
I was in radio my whole life. I don't listen. I've got a car with a satellite radio. I listen to classical music off the satellite. That's all I listen to. When they play something I don't like, I switch over to the classical FM station here in LA.
I had a conversation on a QSO Today podcast with somebody that said that we've channelized radio so much that for most people they don't know that there's anything in between. And as kids, one of the fascinating things if you're just getting into radio was tuning that vernier dial and listening to the weird stuff that was in between the major channels.
Yeah.
But nowadays you don't hear that because we've channelized all the communications.
The thrill is gone.
Well, but the thrill isn't gone, is it? Because you're on the radio now.
Well, right, but it's digital. It's channelized. The thrill of, nobody listens, I'm sorry, I don't want to say nobody. Fewer and fewer people are listening to broadcast radio now. That's why broadcast groups are going belly up. Major radio stations are being sold for far less than they were 10 years ago. A $200 million radio station 10 years ago is now going for $20 or $30 million. It's good. Owners are dumping radio stations because they can't make money at it because there aren't enough people listening to it so they can't get the advertising dollar they used to. In my dreams, I'm able to buy a defunct AM radio station's transmitter site and use their tower to load it on 160. We'll see. I know, dream on, right?
No, well, maybe not. I mean, it seems to me in Europe, for example, they're closing all of the broadcast stations.
The AM stations, yeah.
Yes. The AM stations, and I believe at a certain point they're going to close the FM stations because they're going to believe that everybody will receive all of their content over LTE or the next generation of cellular telephone.
Could be.
I'm asking a philosophical question now. Do you think that there's a potential danger to society over the fact that perhaps it won't be possible to communicate over the airwaves, on commercial airwaves with people in states of emergency, or just being able to communicate with everyone? Or do you think that perhaps all these networks are going to solve that problem?
I can't look into the future. Ham radio will certainly be able to communicate.
Right. Maybe we're the last frontier.
Maybe we are. I think ham radio in one form or another will always be around. I think a lot of the AM dial will be gone. Ethnic radio is abandoning AM now and moving to FM. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future.
And why is that? Is it because ethnic radio is now all satellite linked together, and so they just have a whole bunch of transmitters across America?
Sure, they can run it on a shoestring. People who listen to ethnic radio are, they can now, you can buy an FM station so much cheaper than you could way back when. So why not have a higher quality audio signal by having an FM outlet instead of just an AM outlet?
What's the rig that you're operating now?
This is an ICOM. I have an ICOM 7610 that feeds into a PW1, which is seeing its final days. I'm going to send it back to ICOM, have it refurbed, and then sell it. I'm going to replace it with a Elecraft KPA 1500. I've got a 54-foot tower with a DB36 on it. As you know, the lot sizes, property sizes here in LA are about the size of a postage stamp. So I could only put up one tower with one antenna. So that's why I got a DB36. So it's good 80 through 6. And then I got a 2-meter Yagi on top of that.
No, a DB36 is a...
The DB36 has a dipole for 80.
It's made by...
Stepper.
Oh, Stepper. So it's a Stepper.
It's a Stepper DB36.
It changes its radio length. It has little motors that change the tuning on it.
Yeah, it spits out like a tape measure tape in hollow fiberglass tubes. So it's always resonant. No traps.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah. It looks kind of like a palm tree leaves over your house.
Well,
that's probably how your neighbors look at it.
I think it looks like a thing of beauty. I don't think my neighbors think the same thing, but it is what it is.
Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, it's been here long enough. It's just part of the background. I don't think anybody notices it anymore.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has been a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast for a few years already. The biggest reason is that I have an affinity for building electronic devices, especially kits that are well designed and delivered ready to build. Hans Summers, G0UPL QRP Labs founder, owner, and engineering designer, creates the most state-of-the-art transmitters, receivers, and transceiver kits at a very fair price to allow any ham to get on the air for very little money. Be sure to look for Hans in Dayton at the 4 Days in May event at the Fairborn, Ohio Holiday Inn on the Thursday before Hamvention, and at the convention itself in Building 6. I want to thank Hans for continuing to support the QSO Today podcast, and I want to thank you for always using the link on the show notes page to get to QRP Labs, or if you make purchases in person, by telling hams at the convention that you heard about it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too, QRP Labs. And now back to my QSO Today. Do you like a bug or a key, or what do you use?
I have a Bengali sculpture key, paddles. I like high-speed CW. There was a time when I could copy 68 words a minute. I can't do that now. I think I can copy maybe 45. But I just love CW. Although, if you look at my log, you'll see now these days, probably 95% of my contacts are FT8. That'll end as soon as we start getting some sunspots.
I've had some people say that there's kind of this zen to CW, that it's not like having a conversation. You can rag chew with it, but puts you in the right mindset.
I use meditation for that mindset. I use CW
instead of CW.
Yeah, I use meditation instead of CW to get into that zone. There's a lot of interest in CW again that I see. Maybe that's because people know that I'd like to give CW practice on the air, so they seek me out. But there's a guy, there's just a few miles from here, and he's a relatively new ham, but he's got his DXEC, and he's been working on CW. So he and I get together on the air, once or twice or, 3 times a week, and just have a QSO with me mostly sending and him mostly copying. We're also talking on the phone at the same time.
Well, I think that's pretty cool.
And
I've actually thought about building for my grandson. Now, my grandson doesn't have television or radio or internet in his house, so...
Really? So he's the one. Okay.
No, my grandson is 11 years old, but I've actually thought to build him an LTE transceiver with a CW key on it, it's like a bug, but it's all built in with a Raspberry Pi, so that he could learn the Morse code and communicate with me using Morse code as a way to communicate. Putting it on LTE is so that at least he has some connection to something where he doesn't have now.
How does anybody not have internet?
My grandchildren are Yiddish-speaking Hasidim.
Okay.
And we're not allowed to bring anything or do anything, even cell phones. So I've thought I need to introduce him to technology in some way. And so I've actually thought to build him a way to learn the Morse code and communicate with his grandfather.
Good idea. How's his English? Is there a Hebrew Morse code?
It could be better.
Is there a Hebrew Morse code?
That's a very good question. I don't think so. Or a Yiddish Morse code. Maybe this is the way that he's going to learn how to read and write English, because he doesn't read and write English yet.
A Japanese ham friend of mine said he used to have to know, to get his license back in Japan, he used to have to know the Japanese Morse code. And that's no longer a requirement. Now they use the English Morse code.
Isn't that interesting? The universal language. Well, I think that, there's CW ops and all kinds of groups that are springing up that are doing these sprints and stuff on CW. So I think there's probably more CW operators on the air now.
Yeah, I'm in CW ops. I do that occasionally, but I'm not a contester, and I don't like doing contesting. It drives me crazy. It drives me crazier.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think, and people will kick me for saying this, I think FT8 is a wonderful something new and exciting, because it gets people into DXing. It gets people making contacts that couldn't otherwise make contacts. People who are stuck with indoor antennas and low power, or as you said, moonbouts with it. I think changes in technology excite me a lot. I'm sorry, I'm not an old fuddy-duddy. I like changes.
I think that the fuddy-duddies are also disappearing as time goes on. What advice would you give then to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Have fun. When I got back into ham radio, I wanted to. I bought a used ICOM 756 Pro 2 or whatever, and I put up a vertical. I just wanted to see if I would enjoy it again, and darned if I didn't. It was just like it was, except people aren't as polite now. So to returning hams, it can be exactly the way it was when you got out of ham radio, except now there's a whole lot more, and there's a lot more on the horizon. So I think it's exciting.
Now, you say that people aren't as polite as they once were. Do you find that also true in CW?
Yes, I do. There will be CW, they call it DQRM, digital QRM. There will be D-expeditions, and probably more so on CW than on sideband. Somebody will sit on the de-expeditions frequency with a just with a carrier, or just sitting there sending VVVVV, or just something to interfere with them. On sideband, you hear people swearing. You never used to hear that.
Well, but you hear it on TV and stuff now too, right? We're in a different age.
I guess so. I don't watch much television, so it's a loss of propriety. Is that the word? I just don't. People aren't as polite as they used to be. But that's a change. We just deal with it.
I think it also is a cyclical thing. I think
I hope so.
We'll get to the rails where we won't tolerate it anymore, and it'll kind of spring back, and we'll be early to meetings again, and we'll say please and thank you and open the door for people.
I still do that, but I'm an old guy.
I still do that too, but I sometimes get a look like, what planet are you from?
I hope it's cyclical and we're not headed down a slippery slope. So we'll see.
Jerry, you've been a fine guest. I really appreciate your spending an hour with me on the QSO Today podcast.
It's been an honor to do this. Thank you.
73.
Thanks so much.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jerry. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K6QU in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.